Hey there, dear viewer. Did you know that you're gonna die? Now that's not a threat, that's a promise. We're all just ants on a stick marching towards the inevitable death of the universe, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. How's that existential crisis coming along? Doesn't matter, because soon everyone will forget about you, and all that's left will be a completely different world where you basically never existed. How are you feeling? Surely there's a way to stop that, right? I mean, there must be a way to preserve me after I die at least. Well then, viewer who have tormented for absolutely no reason, I'm glad you asked. We're talking about mummies. Yeah, I don't know why that intro was so dramatic. But anyway, mummies. They're dead people who figured out how to not decompose and managed to maintain that fresh, radiant look even after thousands of years. Humans have always been fascinated by mummies, because, come on, all your relatives are rotten away into skeletons, meanwhile your buddy Dave looks the same. That's bound to raise a few eyebrows at least. So without further ado, let's talk about the weird, wild world of mummies. Now mummies have been a thing for a long time, even before humans started intentionally making them. For a body to decompose, it needs oxygen, water, and the right temperature for bacteria to grow in. So all you had to do was remove one of these and your body would stay fresh for millennia. Now we don't exactly know what the oldest natural mummy is, because apparently humans back then were really good at dying at exactly the right place to avoid decomposition. If I had a nickel for every time we found an old dead guy at the bottom of a swamp or in the middle of the desert, I'd have like 20 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened 20 times. Eventually, humans saw this happening and decided to try and replicate the process themselves. The oldest man-made mummy that we found so far was made way back in 5050 BC in what's now northern Chile. Near the area is the driest desert on earth, so it's pretty clear what their inspiration was. These were made by the Chinchorro people, and they had three main methods of mummification. The first one involved taking a dead body and absolutely tearing it apart. They'd remove the heads, arms, legs, and skin of the body and scrape off any remaining flesh off the bones before heat drying the body. Then they'd put the head, limbs, and skin back, and you've got yourself an exact replica of the living person. Perfect for wall art, furniture, and teaching your kids a long-lasting lesson. The second method involved making cuts on the body and removing all the organs inside to dry the body. They'd cut the head off too to remove the brain. Then they'd stuff the body back with grass, straw, pretty much anything they could find, strengthen the bones with sticks, and sew up the cuts that they made. After the whole process, they'd put the head back on and there you go, you had yourself a mummy. The third method was a lot simpler. It basically involved covering the body in some clay and leaving it to dry. So in summary, if you want to preserve a body for a long time, the easiest method was just to dry it out until you've got yourself a human raisin and store it in a cave or something. Now fast forward all the way to 3500 BC. It's time for the ancient Egyptians. They've got pyramids, they've got crocodile gods, and most importantly of all, they've got an unhealthy obsession with death. The perfect recipe for some top quality mummies. You might have heard of these guys, they might have made a movie or two on them. The Egyptian mummies are probably the most famous kind of mummies in the world, probably because of the process used and how well they were preserved, but most likely because of the giant monoliths of solid rock filled with precious gems and metals that they were stored in. Yeah, they're kinda hard to miss, aren't they? Now when I say the Egyptians were obsessed with death, I mean it in the strongest way possible. Like again, you don't just build enormous stone monuments and then fill them with tons of gold for no reason. The Egyptians believed that the person's body had to be preserved so that they could have a good life in the afterlife. And so they were really hell-bent on making sure the body was preserved perfectly. Over the course of the civilization, they developed a mummification method that has resulted in some of the most famous mummies in history. And as usual, it all started with a dead body. Well, I guess you could start off with a live one, but the kicking and screaming does make your job a lot harder. This is a precise art form after all. So kids, welcome to the Bulbasaurav show, the place where we conduct definitely legal experiments for YouTube content. Don't try this at home, but if you do, I was never here. Today we're going to be making an authentic Egyptian mummy just like grandma used to make all those years ago. The first step is to stick this rod up the corpse's nose and smush it around in there for a while until the brain is all nice and gloopy, which is when you let it drip out of the nose, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say, but here we are. Then you gotta wash the skull with some chemicals until it's nice and clean, which is when you make a cut along the stomach and take out all the organs inside. But don't worry, we're gonna be using them very soon. You then have to wash the gaping hole you've just made with palm wine and then fill it with a bunch of herbs and spices. This would make a great Thanksgiving dinner, but that's for another episode. Now comes the fun part. You then bury the body in a chemical called natron, which is a simpler name for sodium carbonate decahydrate. I have no idea what that is, but apparently it's really good at slurping out all the water from your dead relatives. Gotta leave the body under there for 70 days exactly. No more, no less. The Egyptians were very strict about that part. Since this is TV, we have another body that we prepared earlier right here. Don't think about it, you don't want to know. Then we wash the body again and then wrap it in some linen bandages to give it that signature mummy look. Then we cover it in some waterproof and antibacterial gum and we're done with the main body. Now, all we have to do is dry the organs we removed earlier and put them in their own jars, known as canopic jars. And there we have it, an authentic Egyptian-style mummy complete with all its organs. And it'll only set you back around $67,000. Can we afford this? Yeah, this process was a pretty long and expensive one. It was only done by the upper class and people who could actually afford it. The rest of us plebeians had to make do with just drying the body in natron without any of the fancy bandages or chemicals. This method slowly developed over the course of the civilization, and credit to them, was pretty scientific, even if they didn't know the exact reason. I mean, drying the body, antibacterial gum, wrapping it to protect it from the outside world, that's basically how you keep something fresh for a long time, whether it's a bunch of raisins or a freshly murdered human corpse. So there they lay, untouched for thousands of years, a true pinnacle of scientific progress. You know, it would be a real shame if someone were to knock knock. It's Europe, with their limited knowledge of science and their unquenchable thirst for more resources. The Europeans had known about the existence of mummies for a long time, but it was in the 12th century that things really got interesting. To preface this, we gotta take a little lesson in etymology. This is bitumen. You know, the stuff that roads are made out of. It's black and sticky, got some hydros and some carbons in it. You've probably heard of it. The stuff's found naturally in a few places and is pretty good for waterproofing, but it was also used as a medicine back in the olden days. Which isn't that surprising when you consider the fact that pretty much everything was used as a medicine back then. A certain type of bitumen, called piss asphalt, don't laugh, was talked and written about by some famous Arabian doctors back then, so it became a pretty well-known treatment to cover cuts and fractures. Then the Crusades happened, and the Europeans got to know of this magical chemical. They wanted all of it, because God knows they needed it. The natural supply of the piss asphalt wasn't enough to keep up with their demand, so they had to look in other places to get their bitumen fix. Then come in the Egyptians. They had been using bitumen in their mummies for thousands of years because it was good at making things waterproof. This was a different kind of bitumen than the piss asphalt, but they looked very similar, so most people confuse the two. Then, due to some translation errors, the piss asphalt was actually thought to mean whole mummies. So at the end of all this, the Europeans realized that their new magical cure was to eat mummies, and so that's exactly what they did. Doctors in Europe came up with a whole bunch of ways to consume mummies, either by eating them raw, mixing them with wine, powdering them, and so much more. After all, if the dead guy's body was able to stay fresh for so long, then surely it'll work on me too, right? Plus, these mummies were seen as sort of magical at the time, especially because some of them were those of powerful kings and queens, even though almost all the mummies sold were those of common people, but the mummy salesman is more than happy to ignore that fact. As this continued, mummies started becoming a scarcer and scarcer resource in Egypt, and so some crafty salesmen decided to take things into their own hands. This involves stuff like passing off burnt animal meat as mummified flesh, or even making fresh mummies yourself from the bodies of prisoners and slaves. It took until the 18th century for people in Europe to realize that eating the mummified remains of old people had absolutely no health benefits, and the practice eventually died out. But medicine wasn't the only use for mummies that these guys had. Apparently, artists were also really interested in them for their color. Mummy brown was a really popular pigment during the 16th century, and it was made from, you guessed it, ground up mummies. But by far the weirdest use for mummies that these guys came up with were events called mummy unrollings. These were sold out shows where, as the name suggests, they'd unwrap a mummy live in front of a large crowd, which is a really weird form of entertainment, especially during a time when showing your ankles in public was considered a war crime. Eventually, Egypt banned the export of mummies out of their country, and Europe's obsession with mummies ended. So next time anyone asks you why we have so few Egyptian mummies left, you can look them right in the eye and tell them it's because we ate them all. Now, mummification still exists in today's world. Probably the most famous recent mummy is the body of former Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin. I mean, it's not exactly what comes to mind when you think of mummies. It's kinda just sitting there, but it's still a preserved body, so I guess it counts. To be honest, mummification has kind of fallen out of fashion, probably because it's super expensive and nobody wants to see your crusty mummified corpse after you die anyway. So yeah, that was the weird, wild and wacky world of mummies. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment, and watch another video by clicking right here. I'll see you guys later.
I got